My cursor is hovering over the Revoke button. 3 years of classified work. Everything I've built, everything I know, is about to get locked behind a wall I myself just constructed. The Defense Secure Access portal stares back at me. The button glows red. Revoke. One click, and a $4.2 billion project stops cold. I take a breath. Let me tell you how I got here. My name is Walt Mercer. For 33 years, I've been designing and maintaining critical infrastructure for the U.S. military and its partners. Not the kind of work you put on a resume. Not the kind of work you talk about at dinner parties. This is the deep stuff, the systems that keep adversaries from knowing what we're doing before we do it. The architecture that makes sure the right people have the right information at the right time, and everybody else stays in the dark. I started in 1991. The Cold War was still making people nervous. I was 26 years old, fresh out of graduate school in systems engineering, and I'd just landed a clearance to work for a contract firm called Meridian Defense Solutions. We were small then, maybe 40 people. I was employee number 38. The offices were in a nondescript building in Northern Virginia, the kind of place you drive past every day and never think twice about. My first project was maintaining classified communications networks for NATO installations. Not sexy work. Lots of late nights, plenty of code, a few all-nighters when systems crashed at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. But I was good at it. I understood the architecture at a deep level, not just how to fix things, but why they were designed the way they were. Why redundancy mattered. Why certain protocols couldn't be altered without causing cascading failures across multiple allied nations. I learned to think like the system. I learned to anticipate problems before they surfaced. Over the years, I moved between projects. A hardened cybersecurity overhaul for the Strategic Air Command's nuclear facility infrastructure. A real-time intelligence fusion network that connected satellite data with ground-based sensors. A classified communications backbone that let special operations units coordinate across continents without the Russians or Chinese knowing what was happening. Each project was bigger than the last. Each one taught me something. Each one made me less replaceable. By 2005, I was leading a team of 12 people. By 2010, I was the chief architect for everything Meridian did in the classified space. Billions of dollars in contracts, hundreds of people reporting through chains that eventually led back to my technical decisions. When a problem surfaced, the government called me. Not the VP, not the board, me. I was the person who understood why things worked the way they did. And I was good with that. I wasn't the type who needed the corner office or the fancy title. I liked the work. I liked knowing that the systems I'd designed were protecting people. I liked that my name was on technical documents that would probably be classified longer than I'd be alive. I liked the intellectual puzzle of it, solving problems that nobody else was allowed to know existed. Meridian grew. We went from 40 people to 400. We opened new offices. We won bigger contracts. The company went public. The guy who founded it made a fortune. I made a decent living. More than decent, if I'm being honest. But I wasn't doing it for the money. Then, in late 2023, the board of directors hired a new VP of operations. His name was Bryce Weston. He was 39 years old, Harvard Business School, previously a senior consultant at McKinsey. He'd never worked in defense contracting before. He'd never had a security clearance. He'd never designed a classified system or debugged code at 3 in the morning while waiting for a satellite pass that only happens once every 72 hours. Bryce had the kind of confidence that comes from always being the smartest person in the room, when you're surrounded by people who care about quarterly earnings and market share. He had perfect teeth and a power suit, and the kind of firm handshake that's designed to establish dominance. I saw him at a company all-hands in January 2024. He got up in front of 400 people and talked about optimizing operational synergies and leveraging human capital and driving agile transformation across our tactical verticals. I remember thinking, this guy has no idea what he's walking into. The thing about running a classified defense contractor is that you can't just apply standard business thinking. You can't optimize security. You can't make it leaner. You can't move faster without creating vulnerabilities. You can't cut corners because the corners are what keep the system standing. Bryce Weston didn't understand this. He thought he could. His first move was to schedule one-on-ones with all the senior staff. When I walked into his office, a corner office he'd already redecorated, by the way, he started talking about aligning my contributions with forward-looking business objectives and exploring new revenue streams in the commercial space. He wanted me to mentor junior staff more. He wanted me to document everything I knew so that the company wasn't over-dependent on individuals. He used that phrase, over-dependent on individuals. I'm not over-dependent. The systems are dependent on people who understand how they work. There's a difference. I told him I was happy with my current role. He smiled. That smile told me everything I needed to know. He thought he could move me. The second week of February, Meridian won a contract renewal on the Sentinel program. That's what we called it internally, a classified upgrade to the integrated missile defense system that covers North America and NATO allies. The budget was $4.2 billion. The timeline was 18 months. The scope was immense. And it couldn't move forward without the original architecture being completely redesigned and revalidated against new threat parameters. I was the original architect. I designed the core infrastructure back in 2009. No one else at Meridian had all the context. Hundreds of people had touched pieces of it over the years, but nobody knew the full picture except me. That's not bragging. That's just how these things work. One person has to hold the vision. The day we got the contract, Bryce walked past my desk and said, "Great news about Sentinel. We're going to need your expertise to get this moving." I nodded. I'd already been thinking about the approach. I'd already sketched out the redesign in my head. "I want to see your proposal in 2 weeks," he said. "And I want you working with a team lead so we start building redundancy in the critical path knowledge." I didn't say anything. I just started working. The proposal took me 18 hours. I worked through one weekend. I mapped out every module that needed to be updated. I identified which vulnerabilities in the original design would be exploited by modern threat vectors. I proposed a phased approach that would minimize risk while maintaining operational continuity. It was good work, clean work, tight work. Bryce reviewed it on a Thursday. He called me into his office that afternoon. He was sitting behind his desk and he had this look on his face like he'd figured something out. "This is great, Walt, really great," he said. "But I'm concerned about timeline. 18 months is tight. I want to see if we can accelerate things by bringing on more people. I want redundancy from day one. I don't want this project to be dependent on you." There it was again, that word, dependent. As if me being essential was a flaw to be engineered around instead of a resource to be managed. "The timeline is fixed," I told him. "Accelerating the schedule doesn't make the work faster. It just introduces more risk and more failure points. What I've proposed is the fastest, safe way to do this." He leaned back in his chair. "I hear what you're saying, and I respect that. But I've been brought in to make this company more efficient, more scalable. I can't have critical projects hanging on one person. That's not how modern organizations work." I wanted to tell him that modern organizations in the classified space aren't normal organizations. They're organized around what works, not what looks good on a PowerPoint. But I could see this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a power move, and he was the new VP, and I was the person he wanted to prove something to. "I'll start bringing people up to speed," I said. "Good. I want you to mentor them. I want you to be a force multiplier instead of the bottleneck." I wasn't the bottleneck. The project was the bottleneck. But whatever. Over the next 6 weeks, Bryce hired 2 new senior consultants and reassigned 3 mid-level engineers to work on Sentinel. Good people, most of them. Smart. But they didn't have the context. They didn't understand the original design philosophy or why certain decisions had been made a decade and a half ago. I spent my evenings writing documentation. I held training sessions. I answered questions about implementation details that would take a new person 6 months to fully grasp. And Bryce started making moves, small moves, moves designed to test me. He wanted Sentinel meetings scheduled during my usual lunchtime. He wanted my technical recommendations reviewed by committee before they got to the government. He wanted deliverables pushed up to him before I could present them to the client. He was micromanaging me in ways that didn't make sense except for one reason. He wanted me to feel like I wasn't in control anymore. I noticed it. I just didn't respond to it. The first week of April, we had a company all-hands meeting, 400 people in a conference center. Bryce was on stage talking about the new direction of the company. He was talking about how Meridian was moving toward a more collaborative, team-based approach, and how the era of the individual contributor was coming to an end. Then he said, "We want to recognize the incredible talent we have across the organization. People who are doing great work. People who are stepping up." He looked right at me, and he said, "Walt Mercer has been a cornerstone of this company for over 3 decades. And starting this month, Walt is going to transition into a new role as a senior consultant, where he'll be focusing on mentorship and knowledge transfer. We're bringing in a new director of critical systems to lead our major projects going forward." The applause started, but it wasn't the applause you want. It was the applause you get when something important dies, and nobody wants to say it out loud. He just demoted me in front of 400 people, and he'd done it by wrapping it in language about my transition and new opportunities. I sat there in the crowd and I felt something shift, not anger, clarity. This was the moment everything changed, and Bryce had no idea what he'd just done. I didn't say anything that day. I walked out of the conference center, got in my car, and drove home. It was a Wednesday. The sun was starting to set over the Virginia hills. I had a bourbon and sat in my study, and I thought about 33 years. 33 years of showing up. 33 years of being the person who knew. 33 years of taking calls on weekends and canceling vacations because something broke, and I was the only person alive who could fix it. 33 years of building things that mattered, things I couldn't even tell my wife about, things that would outlive me by decades. And on Wednesday afternoon, a guy who'd been in the defense industry for 4 months decided he could reorganize around my irrelevance. The thing that struck me, sitting there in the dark, wasn't the humiliation. It was the absurdity. Bryce thought he'd just neutralized me. He thought demoting me in front of 400 people would make me compliant. He thought assigning me to mentorship would keep me busy and out of the way while his new director of critical systems, some woman from Lockheed Martin named Patricia something, stepped in and took over Sentinel. But he'd made a tactical mistake. He'd told everyone that I was being moved to a different role. He'd said I was no longer leading the major projects. And more importantly, he'd told the Defense Contracting Board and the government that Meridian had a new organizational structure, which meant my security clearance for Sentinel, the clearance that had been attached to my role as the chief architect, had just become defunct. A senior consultant focused on mentorship doesn't hold the kind of access required to lead a $4.2 billion classified systems redesign. That access belongs to the director of critical systems. I had my bourbon. I thought about it. And I realized something very simple and very clean. If I was no longer the person leading Sentinel, then I didn't have any legitimate reason to hold the clearance for Sentinel. And if I didn't hold the clearance, then I couldn't access the system. And if I couldn't access the system, then nobody could verify what needed to be done next, because I was the only person alive who understood the verification matrix. The architecture, the threat assessment, the design parameters, the phased approach, all of it was locked in a secure portal that required a personnel clearance I no longer technically held. The new director of critical systems could access the files. She could read them, but she wouldn't understand them, not without me. Not without those 18 months of training I'd started to give her, except now I was a senior consultant. Now I was mentoring. Now I was out of the loop. I finished my bourbon. I went to my home office. I booted up my secure terminal, the one with the government-grade encryption that lets you access classified systems from an approved location. I entered my credentials. The Defense Secure Access portal opened. The interface is gray and clinical. No logos, no branding, just pure function. I navigated to personnel clearances. I navigated to my profile. I could see the list of programs I had access to. Sentinel was right there. Active, authorized, waiting. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes looking at that list. This was the moment where I could back down. I could think about the retirement I was supposed to have. I could think about how much it mattered to me, or didn't matter. I could think about whether this was worth it. But then I thought about the smirk on Bryce Weston's face when he was talking about the era of the individual contributor. I thought about the way he'd said my name in that all-hands meeting, like I was a sunset and he was the sunrise. I thought about how he wanted to be the kind of executive who'd optimized away the dependence on Walt Mercer. Well, let him try. I clicked on Sentinel's access information. The portal asked me to confirm the action. Are you sure you want to revoke your security clearance for this program? There were 3 options: no, go back, and yes, confirm revocation. My finger moved to the trackpad. I was calm, completely calm. This wasn't rage, this wasn't desperation. This was chess. This was the kind of clear-eyed decision-making that I'd spent 33 years developing. I clicked yes, confirm revocation. The system processed for maybe 2 seconds. Then a notification appeared. Your clearance for Sentinel has been revoked as of 4/10/2024 at 17:43 Eastern Standard Time. You no longer have access to any materials, systems, or communications related to this program. All previous access is terminated. This action cannot be undone without recertification. I closed the portal. I closed my laptop. I sat in my study in the dark and I smiled. Bryce had wanted to prove that the project didn't depend on me. I'd just proven that the project absolutely depended on me. Not because I was special, but because I was the only person who understood the original architecture, and now I was the only person who couldn't access it. The Friday after, I went to work. I sat at my desk. I answered emails. I had lunch with one of the junior engineers and answered some questions about how to think about system redundancy. I was the picture of professionalism. The picture of a guy who'd been gracefully transitioned and was now settled into his new role. But I didn't mention anything about the revocation, and I didn't do anything to notify the government that the chief architect of Sentinel had just eliminated his own access to the program. I just waited. The government was going to find out on Monday morning, when Patricia tried to log into the system and realized that her team couldn't access the threat assessment matrix or the Phase 1 deployment architecture. The government was going to find out that Meridian's new director of critical systems didn't have the clearance level required to understand what they were supposed to be building, and they were going to ask questions. And Bryce Weston was going to have to explain why he'd demoted the one person who actually knew what was happening. I drove home that Friday afternoon. I felt lighter than I had in 6 months. I stopped at a grocery store and picked up some fresh trout and some vegetables. I grilled the trout over charcoal. I watched the sun set over the hills. I slept better than I had in years. Saturday, I took my boat out on the water, just me and the river and the sound of the outboard motor. I didn't think about work. I didn't check my email. I didn't wonder what was happening on the Sentinel program. I was done with all of that. I caught a bass around noon, put it back. The day was clean and blue, and there was nobody in the classified space who could do anything about the situation except figure out what had actually happened. By Saturday evening, they started to realize. I didn't know it then, but people at the government level, the contracting officer, the program manager, the security officials, were starting to notice that the Sentinel documentation wasn't accessible to the new team lead. Emails were piling up with subject lines like, "Cannot access verification materials," and "Phase 1 deployment details unavailable." By Sunday morning, somebody had pulled the access logs and realized that I'd revoked my clearance on Friday afternoon. Sunday afternoon, Bryce called me. His voice was different. Tight, controlled, but different. Walt, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. There's an issue with Sentinel. What kind of issue? I asked. We need to talk about it in person. Okay, I said. I'll be there at 8. I hung up. I made coffee. I watched the sunrise. Monday was coming and everything was about to change. I showed up to work at 7:55 on Monday morning. The parking lot was already full. That was unusual. Meridian didn't start early unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. I walked into the main lobby and I could feel it, that electric tension that happens when people have been awake all night, and the stakes have just gotten very real. Bryce was waiting for me in the hallway. Behind him was Patricia, the new director of critical systems. She looked like she hadn't slept. Behind her was Marcus Chen, the chief operating officer. Behind him was someone I didn't recognize, a man in a dark suit with the kind of bearing that meant he worked for the government. We need to talk, Bryce said. In my office. Now. His office was on the 4th floor. The view was nice if you liked looking at parking lots. We walked in. Bryce, Patricia, Marcus, the government guy, and me. Bryce closed the door. I'm going to be direct, Bryce said. Your clearance for Sentinel was revoked on Friday. We've confirmed it with the Defense Contracting Board. You terminated your own access to the program. I need to know why. I sat down in one of the chairs facing his desk. I was calm. I'd had all weekend to think about how this conversation would go, and I was ready for it. You demoted me, I said, in front of 400 people. You told them I was no longer leading the major projects. You told them I was transitioning into a new role as a senior consultant. You created an organizational structure that explicitly removed me from any position that would justify holding a top-level clearance for Sentinel. That's not a reason to revoke your access, Patricia said. She was angry, but it was the kind of anger that comes from panic. She was panicking. You had no right. I had every right, I said. Personnel clearances are tied to roles. Roles are tied to organizational position. Bryce created a new organizational structure that didn't include me in any capacity that would justify that clearance level. I made a choice. I could either hold on to access I no longer had any legitimate reason to hold, or I could clean up the security problem. I chose to revoke my access. You knew exactly what you were doing, Marcus said. His voice was quieter. He understood. He understood the game that had been played. I did, I said. I knew that someone had to tell you that demoting the chief architect of a $4.2 billion program was a bad idea. I thought I'd do it in a way that was impossible to ignore. The government guy, later I found out his name was Colonel Richard Hayes, and he was the Defense Contracting Board's senior program director, stepped forward. He was the one who actually ran the Sentinel contract for the government. He was the one who was responsible if the program failed. Mr. Mercer, let me understand this clearly, he said. You revoked your own clearance because you disagreed with an organizational decision. I revoked my own clearance because I was demoted in a way that explicitly removed me from the position I'd held while carrying that clearance, I said. The organizational structure now doesn't justify me holding top-level access to Sentinel. I was pointing out a security problem. The security problem is that the chief architect just cut himself off from a critical program, Patricia said. The real security problem is that the chief architect was demoted right before a major redesign, I said. And apparently nobody thought about what that meant for program continuity. Colonel Hayes looked at Bryce. The documentation says you moved Mr. Mercer to a mentorship role and brought in Ms. Chen as the new director. Is that accurate? Yes, Bryce said. His voice was smaller now. We felt it was important to reduce organizational dependence on any single individual. And who is now the individual who understands the original architecture well enough to oversee the complete redesign? Colonel Hayes asked. Nobody said anything. That's what I thought, he said. He turned to me. Mr. Mercer, I need you to understand something. We have a program that needs to move forward. We have a schedule. We have resources. And now we have a bottleneck. The question I need you to answer is, what do you want? I'd thought about this moment all weekend. I'd thought about what I wanted, what was fair, what would work. And the answer had been clear to me for a long time. I want to lead Sentinel, I said. Full authority over technical decisions. I want to report directly to Marcus, not through Bryce. I want a team of 5 senior engineers, people I choose, reporting to me. And I want an apology, a real one, in front of the company. Bryce's face went white. That's not going to... No, Marcus said. He's right. He's absolutely right. Marcus looked at Colonel Hayes. Is that acceptable from the government's perspective? Colonel Hayes thought for a second. We don't typically involve ourselves in internal company structure. But yes, if Mr. Mercer is leading the program with full authority, we can work with that. We need this program to move, and he's the person who can make that happen. Bryce stood up. This is blackmail. This is extortion. He can't... Actually, I can, I said. I can walk out of here, keep my access revoked, and let you figure out how to redesign a $4.2 billion system without anyone who understands the original architecture. Or you can put me back in the position I should have stayed in, and we can deliver this program on time and under budget. Those are your options. The room was quiet. Bryce looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Colonel Hayes. Colonel Hayes was looking at me. Mr. Mercer, we're going to need you to recertify your clearance, Colonel Hayes said. The revocation stays in the system, but we'll process emergency recertification for the Sentinel program, with you in full technical authority. Can you be ready to start that process today? I can be ready right now, I said. Good. Patricia, you're going to work with Mr. Mercer as a senior technical advisor. You'll learn the system. In 18 months, you might understand a quarter of what he knows. That's not an insult. That's just how long it takes. Bryce will need to discuss the management structure, but I think it's clear that Mr. Mercer needs to be in a position of actual authority, not a mentor role. Is that clear? It's clear, Bryce said. He looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. I walked out of his office at 8:23 on Monday morning. I went down to my desk. I opened my secure terminal. By 8:35, the Defense Contracting Board had sent through emergency recertification paperwork. By 9 o'clock, I had full access to Sentinel again. Better access, actually, because now I was formally the chief architect in the organizational structure, not just in practice. The company sent an email at 9:15. Effective immediately, Walt Mercer has been promoted to Chief Architect of Critical Systems, reporting directly to COO Marcus Chen. He will lead all technical decisions on the Sentinel program. Patricia Chen will support him as Senior Technical Advisor. Bryce's title stayed the same, but his authority had just been gutted. Everyone knew it. The entire company knew it. The government knew it. By noon, articles were starting to circulate about the reshuffling. Nothing classified, just business publication stuff about reorganizations and leadership changes. Bryce lasted until September. He took a job at a defense firm in San Diego that was mostly focused on commercial contracts. Nobody was surprised. The company would have canned him, but Meridian decided it was cleaner to let him leave for new opportunities. Patricia actually worked out. She was smart enough to recognize that she didn't know what she didn't know. She asked good questions. She listened. By the end of the first year, she understood maybe 30% of the Sentinel architecture, and she knew which engineers could handle which components. She became a genuinely good second-in-command. The Sentinel program delivered on schedule. The redesign was clean. The threat assessment matrix I'd proposed caught 3 vulnerability classes that the new threat model would have exploited. The Phase 1 deployment went live on time. And when the program was done, it was done right. The kind of work that doesn't have to be revisited for another decade because the foundation is solid. I didn't get an apology from Bryce. I didn't need one. What I got was a $4.2 billion program that moved exactly the way it needed to move, led by someone who actually understood it, and an organizational structure that recognized that some roles require specific expertise and that expertise deserves actual authority. I stayed with Meridian for another 5 years. I trained people. I designed the next generation of classified systems. I mentored engineers who went on to lead their own programs. And when I finally did retire, I did it on my own terms, at a time I chose, after completing the work I'd started. The last day I was in the office, Marcus took me to lunch. We sat on a rooftop in Arlington, and he said something I've thought about a lot since then. "You could have fought that demotion in a lot of ways," he said. "You could have gone to the board. You could have threatened to quit. You could have gone nuclear in any number of directions. But what you did was elegant. You pointed out the problem in a way that nobody could ignore, and you made the solution impossible for them to argue with. That's the difference between fighting and winning." He was right. The moment Bryce demoted me, he'd created the conditions for his own loss of power. He'd just done it by not understanding what he was dealing with. He'd walked into a situation where knowledge was actual power, and he'd tried to manage the knowledge holder by pretending the knowledge didn't matter. It did matter. It does matter. And the people who understand that, who recognize that some expertise is irreplaceable, that some people have earned the right to lead because they're the only ones who know how to do it right, those are the people who build things that last. 33 years of work taught me a lot of things. But maybe the most important thing it taught me was this: never let someone's title determine your value. And if someone tries to rewrite the structure around you, make sure the new structure is the one that can't actually function without you. My cursor hovered over that Revoke button for maybe 5 minutes that Friday afternoon. But in a way, my hand had been moving toward it my entire career. Every system I'd designed, every piece of knowledge I'd accumulated, every decision I'd made to be the person who understood, all of it was pointing toward that moment. When the time came to prove that my value wasn't negotiable, I was ready. And on Monday morning, when everything came crashing down, Bryce Weston finally understood what he should have known all along. You don't build organizations around the people you have. You build them around the expertise you need. And if you're smart, you make sure the people who have that expertise are treated like the irreplaceable assets they actually are.